Global market volatility, China's Xi Jinping travels to the Middle East. What's next as the Iran nuclear deal is implemented, and who will be the next US president? Big stories, and we'll tackle them all. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is a special edition of The Heat. On most days, we go in-depth on a single story, but every so often we like to take a step back from our usual format and spend a bit of time gathering fresh insight and analysis from those covering world events. To help us dive into these issues, we've put together a distinguished panel of journalists. Joining us here in Washington is Afshin Molavi. He's worked for Reuters, The Washington Post, and the Arab News, and is currently editor of the New Silk Road Monitor. With us from New York is Lorna Shadegg. She's a correspondent for Feature Story News. My colleague Nathan King joins us here in Washington, and also with us is China Daily's chief Washington correspondent and the deputy editor of China Daily USA, Chen Weihua. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Weihua, let's start with President Xi Jinping's visit to the Middle East. He visited Iran, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Was this visit just about trade and economic relations, or was there a bit of a diplomatic and political dimension to it?
I think you first have to realize, the Xi Jinping government is more active than previous government in terms of diplomacy. And Xi has visited 17 countries in the past year, compared actually like 10 countries paid by President Obama. So you see more active diplomacy by the Chinese leadership. And the Middle East, Chinese have always seized the traditional friendship we have, with Egypt. I remember just in the Egyptian bar in New York, the Egyptian owner would say, oh, Chinese are our brothers, so, invite me to belly dance on stage. So all these things, the long-standing. And, it's interesting when you talk about trade, China sees it very differently. For example, the Silk Road, one belt or one road. China very much believe, the chaos in the Middle East, one of the solution is development and creating job for these young people in the Middle East. So that's actually, one solution to sort of a stability issue. And I think, obviously, China has a huge, trade interest. Saudi being the largest oil supplier, Iran, one of the biggest. So we all want, China very much want Middle East to be peaceful, stable, and it's, when the West sort of approach has failed,
Right. Nathan, in that vein, President Xi has invited the foreign minister of Syria, Walid al-Muallim, as well as the head of one of the Syrian opposition groups, the Syrian National Coalition, to a meeting in Beijing, an attempt to find some kind of a solution to what appears to be an intractable problem there. Is this an indication that China is actually going to engage more in this region on the political problems of the region? No one else has succeeded so far, as Weihua just pointed out.
Yeah, I think Weihua touched on it, that Beijing has now a much more presence in terms of international relations, but it doesn't take sides, and that was a key element of the Middle East visit. Xi Jinping and the rest of the Chinese leadership have good relations with Saudi Arabia and good relations with Iran. Of course, two of the main proxies involved in the Syrian civil war. So when you actually meet with the opposition and the government in Beijing and you don't take sides, that gives extra clout. But China's not doing this on its own. It's a permanent member of the Security Council. It is very much invested in finding a solution to this. Great power rivalry divided the UN at the beginning of this war, but it's been going on for 5 years now. And there is a sense of urgency, especially since the last United Nations General Assembly, of trying to get all the parties together. And China is playing its part as an honest broker in the region. We'll wait and see. As we know, the peace talks aren't going that well. Not everyone's at the table, but all these efforts are being coordinated between the capitals of the permanent 5 members.
Lorna, what is your view? Is there a feeling that China is now taking a more vigorous role in the Middle East? Up to now, it's been the United States largely that's led the international effort to solve many of those problems in the Middle East.
Well, I think there is certainly that view, and it's interesting if you look at the statistics, and several American media outlets have pointed this out, that actually Xi Jinping travelled to more countries last year than Barack Obama, 14 to his 11. And really there is an attempt by Xi Jinping to put China out there on the world map, and the Middle East, of course, is no exception. Worth pointing out, though, of course, that the Middle East is crucial for China, given that it is the world's largest oil importer, and over half of its crude oil does come from the Middle East region. And so, of course, it's no accident that Xi Jinping is attempting to make inroads in that area. But the timing is very important. It's interesting that Xi Jinping went to these countries after those sanctions on Iran had been lifted, thus avoiding ruffling the feathers of any Western powers, which he might have done before had he gone earlier. So he's being very careful in that respect. But it's also interesting that, of course, Saudi Arabia is growing in its alienation from the United States. And I think Xi Jinping got a much warmer welcome in Riyadh than he would have done before that alienation started.
Afshin, is China great taste in ties and shirts, by the way?
You're matching,
Great combination.
We didn't call each other ahead of time.
Is China seen by many countries and groups in the Middle East as more of an honest broker than, say, the United States? I mean, we know the United States is seen by many as having too much support for Israel or for Saudi Arabia or the military leadership in Egypt. So does that put China in a better place to help negotiate these problems?
I think China certainly has an opportunity to negotiate and to play a broker role, but particularly between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two regional heavyweights, and as Nathan noted, who are fighting proxy wars across the region. China certainly has the ability to do so. The question is, are they going to want to invest the kind of heavy diplomacy required to do so? I mean, the Iran-Saudi Arabia conflict right now is an intense one, and one might even say intractable one that can probably only be solved when the two capitals decide to solve it. And it's going to require some pretty intense diplomacy, and is Xi Jinping prepared to do that? Because one of the things I noticed in the number of countries he had visited, I wondered why it took him so long to visit the Middle East. After all, as Lorna noted, more than 50% of China's oil imports come from the Middle East, North Africa region, headed for 70% by the year 2030. A very important energy relationship with Saudi Arabia. But the optics of the Saudi Arabia visit and the Egypt visit were extraordinary. As soon as Xi Jinping's airplane entered Saudi airspace, it was escorted by 4 F-15s. And as soon as he entered airspace in Egypt, escorted by 8 F-15s. So this was an extraordinary visit, and those kind of symbols matter.
Nathan, let's move on to Iran after that nuclear deal. That deal is now being implemented, of course.
Yeah.
Is it all going according to plan?
I don't think anyone thought it would be this good. It's quite incredible how everyone, when they signed on to the Joint Plan of Action, that everyone stuck to their guns. And in fact, Iran has shipped most of its material out of the country, dismantled centrifuges, disabled the potential plutonium reactor ahead of schedule. There has been a huge amount of cooperation between the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and Germany, or the EU 3+3, and Iran on this. And we've seen it in other areas as well, which is quite incredible. When those 10 sailors found themselves in Iranian waters, they weren't held for days, as happened before, and would normally happen. They were released within 24 hours. Then we've got this prisoner swap, as this deal just got implemented. This is quite incredible. The Washington and Iran now speak to each other, it looks like, more regularly than Washington and Saudi Arabia. And of course, all the other players involved have become much warmer to Iran as well. Now, China has always had warm relations with Tehran, but you can see it with the Europeans as well. The big question now is, what if something goes wrong? Because is everyone going to turn around and isolate Iran again? It's going to be very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle.
Afshin, the Iranians, of course, have wasted no time in making their presence felt. Right after this deal was signed, President Hassan Rouhani has visited Italy, he's visited France, he's been to the Vatican as well, met the Pope. He's busy building this economic relationship with Europe. In fact, Iran has put in an order for something like 100 aeroplanes from Airbus. It's doing business with
Not,
Peugeot.
not Boeing's, Trump said. Trump was angry.
Well, that is my question, actually. The United States, Afshin, was not on his shopping list. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me right now, and I'll tell you why. I think there's still a whole range of residual sanctions in place that still make it difficult to do business deals with Iran if you're a U.S. company. And there's also a little thing called the U.S. presidential election coming up. And Republican candidates have all kind of one after another said that they would like to rethink the Iran nuclear deal. And that kind of talk is heard very well in corporate boardrooms in the United States. And if you're going to put serious investment dollars in Iran, you don't want a year from now to have the nuclear deal be turned back in some way, shape, or form. So it doesn't surprise me. But I think what we will see from the U.S. companies is anything that can be transactional, the sale of airplanes, the sale of goods, the sale of parts and that sort of thing, I think we'll see happen. But when it comes to heavy foreign direct investment, the U.S. companies are going to stay on the sidelines, particularly the energy companies.
Lorna, what is the likelihood of something like that happening? Is it likely that a future president in the United States could tear up this agreement and just say, as far as we're concerned, it doesn't exist anymore? I mean, several Republican candidates have already been talking about that, saying that we're not going to honor this agreement if we become president.
They have indeed. In fact, it's featured quite heavily on the campaign trail, but I think it would be practically pretty difficult, not least because the sanctions which brought Iran to the negotiating table in the first place have now been lifted. So the US has lost that leverage that it had beforehand. And it's also relatively high risk because in dissolving that deal, you effectively set off a race for Iran to develop a nuclear bomb before any new sanctions could be imposed. So it could be a pretty high risk and dangerous strategy. Nonetheless, it's true that a Republican president with a majority in Congress could potentially scrap that deal, introduce new sanctions on Iran, or revive the ones that we've just seen lifted. But essentially, I think it's more likely than rather than dissolving it, perhaps a Republican president might try to start building up a case against Iran by sort of trying to look for, catch it out, cheating on the deal in some way, or dragging its feet over implementation. That is a more likely scenario than scrapping it altogether, which, as I say, could be a much more high-risk move.
Right, well, China and Iran have always been on friendly terms. In fact, Beijing has stood by Iran even at the worst of times. How do you see this relationship grow from here?
I think, because some of the sanctions actually targeted the Chinese companies doing business with Iran. So this means the Chinese companies can be free of doing business. I mean, actually, I think if you think, I just want to reflect on what the other said. China has been an honest broker. I mean, whether in the Iran nuclear deal, when there was a sort of a certain part of a reactor hit a deadlock, it was the Chinese who provided sort of a wisdom to move it ahead. I mean, China talked to President Assad in Syria and also invited the rebel leader to Beijing. So, I mean, I think we are trusted. So that means, when Iran is doing business with the rest of the world, I mean, they're going to trust Chinese more. I mean, rather than the U.S. or maybe the European countries.
I think it's also worth pointing out that when it comes to foreign policy, the Iran deal is one of the few areas in which the US has managed to work successfully, both with China and with Russia. So if it were to be scrapped or rethought in any way, then Washington and a future Republican president could really risk the relationship with both of those countries as well. They may not care about that, but it's certainly a fact diplomatically that it could be a very risky move on that score as well.
Okay, we're going to take a break right now. When we come back, it's been a rocky ride. What's going on in the financial markets? The race for the White House is also heating up. We'll look at that. Plus, what's the next big story? We'll ask our panel. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to our Journalists Roundtable. Let's get right back to it. Market volatility. Lorna, it's been dominating the news. We see those tickers going off at the bottom of our screens all the time. What are the main factors behind these highs and lows that we've been witnessing?
You're right, it has been quite a roller coaster ride here in New York and indeed across the world markets ever since the beginning of the year, really. As 2016 started, I think investors were at something of a crossroads about whether to take an optimistic route or a pessimistic route. And I think really it's all down to oil prices. And we have seen, particularly here in New York, that stocks have religiously tracked the price of oil. And as oil has gone down and down and down, so have the major indices here in New York. And really, that oil price is linked to fears about an economic slowdown in China, which of course is the world's largest importer of oil and second largest consumer of oil after the US. And every time economic data comes in from China, the oil market seems to wobble as a result of it. Added to that, though, of course, we've also seen a great deal of indecision at OPEC, and that decision not to put a cap on the amount of oil being pumped by OPEC members at the end of last year also sent things into a tailspin. Big concerns about a glut of oil on the market. So really, it does seem to be mainly the oil market that is sending stocks all over the place here in New York and indeed globally. But add to that, of course, the Federal Reserve here in the US, which did put up interest rates at the end of last year and signaled that it was intending to do so again gradually over the course of this year. Then, of course, this week we saw that they're holding them steady, at least for now, over concerns about volatility.
Afshin, what is your view on the role that oil has been playing in this roller coaster that Lorna has been talking about? Could the oil price lead the way back? Because we are now seeing some kind of tentative talks taking place between Russia and Saudi Arabia, two of the biggest producers in the world, to cut production, push prices back up.
Sure. It's interesting. I mean, there's really three things weighing on markets right now. It's the oil price, it's the China slowdown, and emerging market slowdown in general. When it comes to the oil, to your specific question, normally when we think of, a fall in the price of oil, we think that's a good thing, right? We think, that we have more money in our pockets from, spending less on gas, the industrial inputs is cheaper, et cetera. But I think there's so many banks that are exposed to shale oil companies and other banks that are exposed to other energy companies around the world. And also what has happened is the fall in the oil price. The danger is this a matter of oversupply, or is this a demand issue? And if it's a demand issue, then it means that global demand is down worldwide, particularly in China, which in many ways has become, China's been like the speedboat, and there have been water skiers behind that speedboat, Australia, Brazil, Venezuela, and as China has slowed down, those water skiers are wobbling a great deal. And so oil can certainly, if I think what we need to find is a price range where, the banks are not as exposed, shale can continue to produce, and some of these oil-dependent exporting economies that were also buying a lot of goods and recycling some of their petrodollars are not as wobbly as they are right now.
So we have China, which is experiencing a slowdown right now, as we've just heard. But to what extent is one other factor in China influencing world markets? It is transitioning its economy now from one that was based on manufacturing, infrastructure development, to one that is going to be based on consumers right now. To what extent is that playing a role?
I think yes and no. Yes, it means that you actually see sort of a volatile equity market, stock market, exchange rate, because Chinese has been conducting sort of a financial liberalization, and I think it's a learning process for them. The stock market has not been mature, for a long time. So it's a quite different scene. So this gives people the impression that China is kind of have a turbulent. But on the other side, you really, I think the Chinese call the new normal. I think it's a really good thing because there's a transition to an economy that's more environmental friendly, more equitable growth, and more better social security network, and so I think moving up the supply chain, I think if that can be achieved, everybody knows that if that is going to be achieved, that means slower growth but much better quality growth. So you have actually, yesterday, if you read the Wall Street Journal, you have Apple, GE, Starbucks CEO coming out saying they are very optimistic about the Chinese market. And the real economy is actually quite good. 6.9%. It's one of the highest in the world, still. If you think the U.S. grow 2.4% in 2015 and only 0.7 in the fourth quarter, so that's amazing. But that means relatively slowdown. So I just hope they're going to achieve that goal for the new normal, and then I think we can deal with a sort of slowdown for a few years.
Okay, who's going to be the next president in the United States? Afshin, we've just had another Republican debate, otherwise known as the new reality show here on television. This one without the frontrunner, Donald Trump. How did it go?
Well, the front runner, Donald Trump, still seemed to make headlines, even without being a part of the debate. But it was interesting to watch this debate without Donald Trump there, and to see, Ted Cruz, took some hits from some of the candidates. And I think we should watch the Marco Rubio candidacy. He's surging in Iowa. But if you look at all the polls, it is pretty extraordinary that Donald Trump could actually take the trifecta, the first three primaries of Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. And I think if anybody told you that 6 months ago, you would have thought they were insane. So it really is interesting to see, how Donald Trump has tapped into a certain amount of angst and anxiety and uncertainty and real anger in some of those voters. And he's riding this wave.
Right, Nathan, I guess if Donald Trump does take the first three primaries, the caucus in Iowa, he gets something called momentum, right?
Yeah, and it's quite incredible that he's at this stage, and everyone thought he would dissolve, in August or September or October, and we're 3 days out, and he's leading in the polls. But remember, Donald Trump's phrase is "Make America Great Again." That means he's appealing to his supporters who think America isn't great. Now, who are they? A lot of surveys have been done that show they're white people who have slipped or slipping away from the middle class, that don't have college degrees, that have made up the bulk of economic success since the end of the Second World War here in the US, but are now losing out. And there's a deep-seated anger in parts of the country that Donald Trump has tapped into. A rejection of Congress, which is approval ratings are 11 or 12%. People are angry, they want change, they think the system is rigged, and Donald Trump, a billionaire, is appealing to these people. It's quite incredible. We haven't seen anything like this in politics for a long time. Even Barack Obama surprised less people than Donald Trump is right now. But we haven't voted yet, so it could all change.
Yeah, Lorna, in both the Republican and Democratic parties, we're seeing support for, I guess, what could be called non-establishment candidates. On the Republican side, we've got Donald Trump, of course. And on the Democrat side, we've got Bernie Sanders. I mean, does it surprise you that people are going for these candidates who might not come from the mainstream?
Well, it doesn't surprise me when you look at what's going on in Europe, because, of course, there as well we have seen non-establishment politicians rise to the fore. Not only somebody like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, we've seen Marine Le Pen in France, Podemos in Spain as well, Pegida in Germany, all of these parties which you might not have given a second thought to a few years ago, which are really driving the political discourse in Europe. So it's perhaps unsurprising that in the American election a similar force might come to the fore as well. But what is interesting is that the people, a little bit as Nathan was saying, who are voting for these candidates don't tend to fall along party lines, and particularly when you look at the Republicans, they tend to fall usually into two blocks. So you have the establishment candidates, people like Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush, and then you have your sort of further right Christian conservatives, people like Mike Huckabee or Rick Santorum. But Donald Trump is creating a new block in the middle of that. So if you look at the statistics regarding Trump supporters, they tend to be lower income, as you were saying, less educated, concerned about competition from abroad, skeptical about free trade. So they are not establishment candidates, but neither are they particularly religious. A lot of them don't necessarily identify themselves as particularly religious, neither are they particularly worried about things like abortion, issues that normally Christian conservatives are very concerned about. So they are a new bloc altogether in American politics. The question is whether that bloc is enough of a force when it comes to the caucuses in Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and so on, whether that bloc is enough to give Donald Trump that momentum and whether he can take it forward and become the nominee.
I just want to add here, it's also a question if they turn up to the polls, because Iowa caucus is very complicated, especially on the Democratic side for Bernie Sanders, and we haven't seen huge amounts of new registrations in Iowa. So Trump could have a lot of support, but will they actually turn out on caucus night? That is going to be key. And by the way, I'm going to be heading up to Iowa, so it's going to be fun.
So we'll watch it through, Nathan. Well, there's a question I've asked you before on how the Chinese view the American election campaign, but at this stage, I mean, you've told us in the past that they're not really interested. Is that still the case? Are they still not interested?
Well, I think it's becoming more interesting, I would say. Actually, the rally Trump had this morning, actually, they reported there was a Chinese group observing, and when they asked her, and the woman said, oh, he is very rich. So I think when Michael Bloomberg jumped in, I mean, he will be known as a rich man, I mean, running for president. You know, I think the Chinese are paying more attention, but I think it will be after primary. You know, my personal, you know, feeling is, you know, I mean, for Bernie Sanders, I mean, even a lot of people think he's idealist, but I think, you know, when you have John F. Kennedy said we want to go to the moon, not because it's easy, but because it's hard, I think America, the richest country, should be able to solve many of the problems Bernie Sanders laid out. I mean, the trouble for me, I know Hillary is a safe bet maybe, but, you know, it's kind of boring to see maybe even 3 Bushes or 2 Clintons in just a short period of time in American history.
Right, let's get to the next big story. Let's go around the table. Afshin, starting with you.
Well, I think it remains the China economy, because when you look at it's the single largest driver of the global economy's downward pressure that we're seeing today, right now. When you look at the big oil exporting economies around the world and the commodities exporters, they're the wobbly water skiers that I referred to earlier. Yeah. You know, when you look at currency, you know, around the world, and when you look at, you know, stock market volatility, let me just give you one example. China published some manufacturing data a few weeks ago. That manufacturing data was weaker than expected. Chinese equities fell, Brazilian equities fell, European equities fell, the S&P fell. In some respects, it's a testament to the success of China's economic growth, the fact that it has become this great big behemoth, that it affects so much of the global economy. And now the question everybody is asking in the institutional investor circles that I work in is, how is China's leadership going to handle this? Are we going to have a hard landing or a soft landing? I think that's the big story.
Lorna?
Well, I think there are a couple of things worth mentioning. First of all, we haven't mentioned it so far, but the Zika virus has been another big story this week. And Barack Obama has announced a big push for the US to try and come up with a vaccine or a cure for it. And that's worth noting simply because I think around 60% of the US population on both coasts and in the Midwest are potentially at risk from that virus. So when and if some kind of treatment is found for that, it will be a very big story and something that US science will now be concentrating on a great deal. So that's one thing. But secondly, worth noting as well this week, Barack Obama announced a ban on solitary confinement for juveniles in detention. And I think that really shows that's where a trend worth watching for Barack Obama as he gets towards the end of this second term. He's really pushing much harder on issues of criminal justice and of race. I think something that he was very keen to avoid in his first term. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on issues like that he tries to push forward more towards the end of his presidency, because of course he, I guess, feels now he has less to lose on that score.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned that. 2 big stories from Lorna. Nathan, what's the next big story?
I'll keep myself to one, but they are connected with something else. Syrian peace talks, or the lack of them. You know, this civil war has raged on for 5 years. It has divided the international community. Since Russia got involved, and you can debate why and all that sort of thing, there has been a renewed realization that everyone has to come together and try and work this out. Not just the Security Council, which of course has been divided, as we know, at the United Nations, Russia, China, US and its allies, but also the regional powers, Iran, Saudi Arabia, increasingly Turkey as well. And also this fits into the fight against ISIS. You cannot have a bleeding sore at the heart of the Middle East without global repercussions, and I think everyone is realizing that now. The big question is, has enough blood been spilt on the battlefield for people to understand that you need peace?
Well, what's the next big story?
Well, I mean, if you ask a few days ago, I would have said the RMB exchange rate, because of being so volatile, I mean, it's depreciated, you know, because it matters to the sort of the wealth of the 1.3 billion Chinese, I mean, myself included, obviously. But now I would say I would agree with Lorna. I mean, the Zika virus, I think, because of the uncertainty, there is no vaccine, you know, to be seen produced in a short period of time. So, and I think so there will be a panic. I mean, already there was a you know, China. I mean, because people traveling between China and South America, Latin America, so much now, and so there is a warning. So I think the certainty is just going to make it a larger news. I mean.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.